So the Native Americans definitely got a raw deal when it came to the European colonization of North America. Let's take some time to talk about the other group that really got the short end of the stick. And that, of course, is the slaves that were brought in from Africa. Now, to understand the African slave trade, you have to understand a concept known as triangle trade. Triangle trade is the trade system that existed between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And the driving force behind this trade system was the production of raw materials in North America. Remember, what exactly is a raw material? It's anything that can be used to make a finished product. So, for example, a tobacco leaf is a raw good. It can be used to make a cigarette. Lumber is a raw material, but it can be used to build a ship or a house. So you have probably seen this map before, but this is the trade patterns that existed between North America, Europe, and Africa. And they make a rough triangle. Now, it all begins in the English colonies, where raw materials such as tobacco, rice, whale oil, lumber, furs are all being produced. They are loaded on the ships and are taken across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. Now, something to keep in mind, under the Navigation Act of 1660, legally, all of these goods must go to England. The colonists are not legally allowed to ship goods to any other country, not to France, not to Spain, nowhere else but England. Now, that does not mean that they don't illegally ship goods to other countries or illegally import goods from other countries, but according to the law, they must send all these goods to England. Once these goods arrive in England, they are placed in factories and are turned into manufactured goods. The tobacco is turned into cigarettes, the lumber is used to build houses and whatnot, and many of these goods are shipped straight back to the colonies. So you may have a farmer in the southern colonies who is smoking cigarettes made from tobacco that he grew. Other finished goods are sent to Africa. And Africa, like the colonies, did not have any factories. It had not developed any kind of industry. And so these European goods were very valuable to the Africans. Things like guns that they could not produce on their own. Or any other iron tools that they really could not produce on their own. So in order to pay for these European goods, Africans would exchange ivory, which is made from elephant tusk, gold, spices, and of course, slaves. Now, I do sometimes get the question, why did the Africans enslave their own people? That's not really how they thought about it. You think about Mexico and Guatemala. Those are both Hispanic nations. But they don't necessarily think of each other as the same people. They are two separate countries. It was the same in Africa. You had several different kingdoms in Africa that would sometimes go to war with each other. And when they would go to war, they would take prisoners. And in order to pay for these European goods, they would exchange slaves. These slaves were taken across the Atlantic Ocean on a trip that is known as the Middle Passage. Thousands of slaves died during this trip. It's not entirely known how many slaves died, but it was not uncommon for 10 to 20% of the slaves on a slave ship to die during the trip. We'll talk about that more here in just a moment. The trip could take anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks, perhaps even longer. Now, most of the slaves that were taken from Africa would end up here in the West Indies on islands such as Cuba or Hispaniola, or one of these smaller islands such as Barbados or Guadeloupe. But some of them were taken to the 13 English colonies. And once they arrived in the 13 English colonies, they were used to grow more raw materials. And the process started all over again. So once slaves grew more raw materials, then these raw materials were sent to England and turned into finished goods. The finished goods were used to trade for slaves in Africa. The slaves were brought to North America to grow more raw materials, and the process just kept going. This is a diagram of one of these slave ships, and you can see just how full they were. They're all lying down. Usually slaves were stacked on top of each other. They would build these really large shelves, is almost what they were like. And the slaves would lie down inside of these shelves, one stacked on top of the other. They would have all been chained together. Their wrists and their ankles would have been chained together. And they were taken up on deck once every morning for 10 minutes in order to get some exercise, and once every evening for about 10 minutes to get some exercise. During that time period, they also would have received a mouthful of some kind of food, and that was really the only movement and exercise they got for the entire trip. 10 minutes every morning and 10 minutes every evening. If a slave became ill, he was simply thrown overboard. They did not want the slave to infect the others. They wanted as many slaves to survive as possible because at the end of the day, this was all about making money. Sometimes slaves would throw themselves overboard and drown themselves. Some did this out of fear. In Africa, these slaves had seen how these same ships would arrive every year, take a boatload of slaves and sail away across the ocean and then return the next year empty. So many of these slaves believed that white Europeans were cannibals. They showed up every year simply to get more slaves so they could eat them. They had no idea that there was this other continent on the other side of the world where these slaves were being taken to work. Other slaves threw themselves overboard as simply a way of showing resistance. It was just sort of their way of saying, they won't get any work out of me. Now, in the colonies, during the early days of colonization, most planters in the southern colonies relied on indentured servants. These were poor people from England who were not able to pay for the trip from England to the colonies. So somebody else would pay for the trip for them, and in return, they would work for that person for a certain number of years. It was essentially a work contract. At the end of that contract, you were free and were supposed to receive around 50 acres for yourself. If you married, your spouse was still free. If you had a child, that child was free. But there was an event that took place in Virginia in 1676, known as Bacon's Rebellion. And this would cause the colonists to start making the transition from indentured servitude to slavery. So Bacon's Rebellion had to do with Native American issues. Nathaniel Bacon was a rich young Englishman. He was an aristocrat who arrived in Virginia in the 1670s. And he was told by the governor that the western frontier was off limits. Essentially, The governor was trying to get rich off of trading with the Native Americans. Now, in order to do this, he had to avoid war with the Native Americans. And this upset a lot of colonists because now the Indians were forming essentially a barricade against further westward expansion. And as more and more Englishmen arrived in Virginia, the land was very quickly being claimed, and more people felt that the natives should be pushed further west. But the governor wouldn't allow it because he was making a fortune trading with them. So finally, Bacon raised an army and essentially attacked some peaceful Native American camps. The governor declared him an outlaw. So he marched on the capital of Virginia, which was at the time still Jamestown, and he burned it. He burned all the churches, burned everything. Now, the people who followed Bacon to Jamestown and put it to the torch included both white indentured servants and African slaves. Now, eventually the rebellion puttered out on its own. Bacon went into hiding in the swamps of Virginia, became ill, and died from dysentery. So the rebellion really put itself out. However, colonial leaders were afraid that another similar rebellion may take place in the future. So they wondered to themselves, how could they keep this from happening? Well, the solution was to start relying more on slavery. Start importing more slaves and start importing fewer indentured servants. The reason was slaves were easier to control, and you did not have to give them land or any other property at the end of their contract because there was no contract. They were slaves for life. Also, if they had children, then those children became slaves, which is actually something that is very rare in the history of slavery. So not only are they easier to control, but you don't have to keep importing them because they'll reproduce on their own. This is a chart that shows the number of slaves that were being imported into Virginia during this time period. The first slaves, you might recall from a previous lesson, arrived in Virginia in the year 1619. And the number of slaves grew very, very slowly up until about 1650. So they were still relying fairly heavily on indentured servants during this time period. It's around 1650 that you start to really see the numbers increase. And then when Bacon's Rebellion takes place, you see another very sharp increase. Very last thing I want to talk about is the slave codes. These are laws that basically say what a slave can and cannot do. And it's after Bacon's Rebellion that the first slave codes are passed. There are two that are passed in the early 1680s. One states that slaves are not allowed to carry weapons or gather in large groups. This obviously would make it more difficult for the slaves to rebel if you can't carry guns or you can't gather to plan a rebellion. There is a second slave code passed shortly after the first one that states that any slaves brought into Virginia or born in Virginia were slaves for life. Like I said, this was fairly rare in the history of slavery. The children of slaves typically were considered free. But in the 13 colonies, if a slave had a child, that slave automatically became a slave itself, or that child automatically became a slave itself. Takeaway from Bacon's Rebellion is it leads to the increase of African-based slavery in the colonies.